They plowed the land, they sowed. They prayed for rain to fall. But when it was time for the harvest, there was no buyer, no contract, no check. Just silence. In just 6 weeks, U.S. agricultural exports to China dropped by 28%. At the port of Åland, shipments of almonds and dairy products collapsed by 40%, and today, in the state of Washington, hay exporters are laying off a quarter of their staff. Customers have disappeared, and Washington is doing nothing to replace them. This is not just a warning, it's the quiet, rapid collapse, confirmed by the state of the U.S. agricultural economy. So ask yourself, how can the richest agricultural economy in the world end up begging for markets while its leaders celebrate a trade war? U.S. sorghum exports to China haven't just decreased, they've been wiped out. In just 2 months, shipments dropped from 1.44 million tons at the beginning of 2023 to 78,000 tons during the same period. This year, a staggering 94.4% drop, according to U.S. Department of Agriculture data. The reason? The retaliatory tariff regime imposed by Beijing, with duties now exceeding 125% on U.S. agricultural products. As a result, American grain is no longer just uncompetitive, it has become commercially non-existent on its largest export market. Meanwhile, the silos overflow and sorghum prices plummet due to the lack of substitute buyers. The U.S. government's response remains symbolic, not structural. The White House's promises that farmers would experience a golden age are increasingly looking like a bad joke, especially as China turns to Brazil and Argentina to sign long-term grain deals. One question remains: if this wasn't the plan, why is no one applying the brakes? The data tells a clear story. Tariffs rise, demand falls, and supply chains are being permanently redirected. Before the trade war, over 90% of U.S. sorghum exports were purchased by China. That pipeline is now broken. But the consequences go far beyond a single crop. As Beijing redirects its contracts to Latin America, the very foundations of America's dominance in global agricultural markets are being methodically dismantled. According to Bloomberg, China's soybean imports from Brazil have surged by 25% in 1 year, while U.S. soybean futures fell by more than 14% in the first quarter of 2025. These aren't tactical adjustments, they are permanent upheavals in global trade architecture. And if U.S. policymakers think the tariffs can be reversed as easily as they were imposed, they are making a fundamental mistake about how global logistics actually work. At the Port of Oakland, the main exit point for refrigerated U.S. agricultural products, the slowdown in traffic has led to layoffs, port parking fees, and increasing economic pressure. Christy McKenna, the port's executive director, raised the alarm, Chinese. Retaliatory measures are threatening not only agricultural exports, such as almonds, dairy products, or beef, but also jobs for dock workers, truck drivers, and warehouse workers. The Port of Oakland operates at 50% imports and 50% exports, a symmetry that makes it particularly vulnerable to trade retaliation. According to the port's traffic reports, China alone accounts for 29% of the port's total trade, and almost all categories of U.S. exports passing through there are now targeted by Chinese tariffs. This is not a theoretical problem, it's concrete: containers stuck, contracts cancelled, and exporters forced to pay fees for cargo now abandoned at sea. Since the tariff increase was announced on April 2 by Donald Trump, forage exporters have been sounding the alarm. 68 maritime crossings were cancelled, according to the Agriculture Transportation Coalition. A hay supplier based in Washington state had to lay off 25% of its workforce in just 2 weeks due to canceled shipments and unmanageable transportation costs. And it's not an isolated case. A wood pallet exporter saw 6,400 tons of goods blocked in storage, with 15 wagons immobilized, incurring massive parking fees while awaiting rerouting instructions. Even worse, a 9,000-ton shipment bound for China is now threatened with total abandonment. 1. Exporter sums up the situation: we cannot absorb the rise in maritime transport costs without selling. Losses are mounting, and the logic falls apart. How can low-margin agricultural products survive in a tariff environment designed for high-value luxury goods? The new U.S. Trade Representative, USTR, regulation imposes port fees exceeding $1.5 million per Chinese ship. Bulk agricultural products are exempt, but not containerized goods. However, containerized products, including meat, poultry, dairy, almonds, frozen foods, and processed potatoes, represent 55% of the total value of U.S. agricultural exports, according to the Department of Agriculture. Peter Friedman from the Agriculture Transportation Coalition warned on CNBC that the lack of exemptions for these containerized products threatens the most profitable segment of U.S. agriculture, just as global buyers are turning away from American suppliers. Despite calls from the industry, the USTR has not responded to requests for regulatory relief. As a result, exporters are now calculating how many containers they can still afford to ship before shutting down entirely. Adapting a supply chain isn't a weekend project, it's a multi-year process involving new contracts, infrastructure, and financing. Take the soybean trade between Brazil and China. It didn't emerge overnight. It took 3 years of gradual volume increases, public subsidies, and massive investments in Brazilian ports. Those systems are now in place, and if the U.S. ever wants to re-enter that market, it will have to do so from a weakened position. Unlike U.S. election cycles, global agriculture does not respond to short-term politics, it follows long-term incentives. According to traders interviewed by Reuters, the message Washington is sending now is one of instability. Buyers are diversifying their sources to protect themselves. The risk isn't just losing this year's contracts, it's disappearing entirely from long-term supply planning. The White House has proposed new emergency aid to prevent a wave of bankruptcies, but several major farming associations, including the National Farmers Union and the American Soybean Association, are expressing doubts. A check doesn't reopen a closed port. It doesn't restore a broken contract. Most of all, it doesn't rebuild lost trust among international buyers. In Iowa, corn growers told Bloomberg they continue planting despite knowing they'll lose money, because planting nothing means going bankrupt faster. In Kentucky, some farmers are considering not harvesting at all. This is no longer about profit, it's about managing losses, a race against bankruptcy. And yet, in Washington, the talk is still about stimulus plans, while the only word farmers want to hear is market access. For the first time in years, major agricultural organizations support legislation to limit the White House's tariff powers. The National Farmers Union now backs a bill requiring congressional approval for major trade decisions, arguing that unchecked executive power has disproportionately harmed agriculture. Peter Friedman was blunt on CNBC, "This is not a crisis in the making, it's a full-blown crisis." Such unity across the agricultural sector is rare and underscores the urgency of the situation. Even the traditionally conservative American Farm Bureau Federation, long considered a pillar of support for conventional agricultural policy, has joined calls for restraint. The conclusion is clear: a unilateral trade war is no longer sustainable. Initially, tariffs were meant to protect American producers from cheap imports. But in practice, according to figures from the Agriculture Transportation Coalition and the Department of Agriculture, retaliatory tariffs from China, Canada, and the EU have not only reduced U.S. agricultural exports, they've also flooded the domestic market with unsold stock. One example: China canceled an order for 12,000 tons of U.S. pork, the largest cancellation since 2020, leaving producers with perishable meat and no alternatives. Meanwhile, new U.S. port fee regulations are making things worse: $1.5 million per Chinese vessel, directly impacting containerized agricultural products, again, 55% of total agri-food export value. These aren't minor disruptions. They are structural penalties that don't even benefit the farmers they were supposed to protect. Food prices are soaring, but farmers are not seeing the benefits. Take Cal-Maine Foods. Amid an egg shortage in 2024, the company posted more than $1 billion in profits. At the same time, small producers were paying 20% more for animal feed.